Greetings, everybody. Keith here. Hoping everybody's having a good day, enjoying life, living life, loving life. I want to remind everybody, hit that like, share, and subscribe button. There's a PayPal link down there for anybody that wants to share some love. And, of course, the StreamYard link for anybody that wants to join the panel. We're going to talk to you tonight about the Trading with the Enemy Act as it relates to indemnification, full acquittance and discharge, amnesty, things like that, and how it all started. And the beginning of this, it's going to talk about the statutes, and this is from Cambridge University. So let me grab the link here real quick. Oops. And I'll drop this for everybody so you can grab this and pull it up yourself. And what we're talking about here, like I said, it's Cambridge University. Cambridge University Press, Cambridge Core. The Secret Life of Statutes. Now, when you look up your state codes, those are known as state statutes. This is 48 CFR 52.212-5. And it says, and that's federal acquisitions regulations. And for the title of that specific section, it says contract terms and conditions required to implement statutes or executive orders, commercial items, commercial services. So the statutes and executive orders are themselves contracts. You read them as contract terms and conditions of an overall contract, of which you have to take an oath in order to then be licensed. And this is an identification system to make sure that you're not trading with an enemy. Interstate Identification Index, managed by the FBI. Federal Bureau of Investigations, like we spoke of last night. Abstract. Well, let's first read. Yeah, abstract. This is 16th of May, 2018. Come on. Why is my computer? I might have too many windows open. Anyway, abstract. Abstract. 1917, Congress passed the Trading with the Enemy Act to prevent trade with Germany and the Central Powers. It was a wartime law designed for wartime conditions, but one that over the course of the following century took on a secret, surprising life of its own. Eventually, it became the basis for a project of worldwide economic sanctions, telling us it's commercial, applied by the United States at the discretion of the president during times of both war and peace. This article traces the history of the law in order to explore how the expansion of American power in the 20th century required a transformation of the American state and the extensive use of executive powers justified by repeated declarations of national emergency. October 6th, 2017 marked the 100th anniversary of the Trading with the Enemy Act. What began as an effort to define, regulate, and punish trading with the enemy in the context of congressionally declared war of limited duration has transformed over the decades into a broad writ of executive authority to wage economic warfare against loosely defined enemies virtually anywhere and at any time. I want to ask everybody in this great nation of America, how comfortable do you feel that at the request of a clown in a suit with a badge, that he demand identification and you cuck up and give it to him? Now, the only reason you would do that is because you already bowed down to a false patronymical king and got an ID through the state because you didn't know how to declare yourself. My opinion, of course. Tracing this history sheds light on what might be called the secret life of statutes, the way the laws survived beyond their initial moment of creation, to be revived, reworked, and redeployed in later times of need. Did you know in the 1920s people were walking around and taking vaccinations and wearing funny masks because they had a pandemic back then too? Over time, through executive proclamations, congressional amendments, and judicial decisions, the Trading with the Enemy Act concentrated more and more power in the hands of the president. By the 1950s, this was after the New Deal was incorporated, and now they had the Uniform Commercial Code and the birth certificate coming in. 1950. It served as the legal underpinning of most of the nation's highest profile economic sanctions regimes, a function that it and its legislative offspring continue to perform. This is the process, folks. One state decides it wants to create a new statute that the other states don't have. So it creates a statute of limitation. That's all they can do. They can't do statutes of expansion. They have to do statutes of limitation. So they create another statute of limitation. The neighboring state sees it, says, hey, that's making them some good money over there. You know, it's a contract term and condition, right? So the next state says, well, hey, we'll implement it too. By the time you get 23 states forward, now you can go to the federal government and implement it at the federal level and make it a contract with the executive office. It's all contracting, folks. It's nothing personal, just business. If you don't know what the business is, then you should stay out of it. Quit applying for it and thinking that it's going to be a benefit, particularly if they refer to a statute. Oh, you mean a contract. The law has granted presidents the unilateral authority to interfere with private economic transactions. Now, I want you to recognize the Trading with the Enemy Act concentrated more and more power in the hands of the president. The law has granted presidents, no one else, it doesn't say anybody else, it just says the law has granted presidents the unilateral authority to interfere with private economic transactions. So anybody that is trying to interfere with your private economic transactions by subjecting you to sanctions of statutes without a valid contract is doing so without the presidential authority so granted, including by freezing assets. Remember, we talked about freezing assets. How do you freeze your assets, folks? Is that the trust? You sell all of your assets at grantor to the trust, and that freezes the assets? Or imposing trade embargoes in times of declared emergencies. Though overshadowed by military operations, U.S. economic sanctions have affected the lives of millions of people around the world. though overshadowed by military operations. How can it be overshadowed by military operations when the very first word is trading? So it must be an economic establishment first. It must have some kind of economic effect. See, the public economic scale has nothing to do with my private rights. So even the Trading with the Enemy Act does not apply to myself. The story of the act, then, is part of the story of the rise of American global power. So if you think there's a one world government and it's not the American global power, then you've been misled. That's their intent. And the legal and government foundations that made possible its exercise. Great job. Both the legal and government foundations are founded by the people. You're the ones following these things. You're the one with the ID in your pocket. I don't have an ID. I don't have a bank account. That's why it's so hard to put up any other kind of links to establish any kind of donations or anything. The one PayPal link is the only thing I've been able to establish yet without ID and without a bank account. Anybody else do that? The Trading with the Enemy Act has drawn the attention of political scientists, lawyers, and economists who have debated the efficacy of sanctions or focused on the law's implications for constitutional interpretation and current policy. Everything's going to refer to that Constitution. That's the real foundation, not the statutes. Far less attention has been given to the Act's historical context and its unexpected outcomes. So now we know it has unexpected outcomes. Do you see how you can use this against them in their very own Trading with the Enemy Act? Since it had the unexpected outcome of causing me harm, detriment, and loss to my person, houses, papers, and effects through the Fourth Amendment of the Constitution, through unsolicited and unknown until recently discovered unlawful takings by the government, a violation of the Fifth Amendment for which I was not compensated, and it was not actually for military purposes. It was simply because somebody got their feelers butt hurt. Historians have chronicled a few of the episodes of heightened activity that have punctuated the history of the Trading with the Enemy Act. Moments when the law justified new government actions, including during World War I, when the act allowed the United States to seize German property, and in 1933, when Franklin D. Roosevelt cited it to proclaim a bank holiday, the ongoing emergency as economic warfare to take your private property. Some also note that the Trading with the Enemy Act justified freezing Japanese assets and the assets of European countries occupied by the Axis before Pearl Harbor. So you suppose maybe the actions of freezing Japanese assets might have been an instigating party or instigating element of a participation of the United States? You suppose maybe Japan bombed Pearl Harbor for a reason? I mean, doesn't the American government call its people assets themselves? So couldn't it be taken that, and we saw this, that afterward they made concentration camps? Don't be misled. As well as imposing embargoes against China and North Korea during the Cold War, let alone Cuba. Remember Cuba? Little has been written, however, about how Congress attempts in the 1970s to rein in executive power led to the Act's reinvention. Nor have historians considered the long arc of the law and its role in shaping U.S. global hegemony. Get into that someday. A historically grounded overview of the evolution and use of the Trading with the Enemy Act sheds light on how the expansion of the U.S. global power reshaped the American state, both at home and abroad, beginning with World War I. Remember, this stuff was instituted in 1917. Wars built the modern state. Understand what they're saying here, folks. You're the one screaming for the supply and demand. This is the economic state that we have in these modern times. And you're the one that screams for it. Scholars often remind us, and military moments have led not only to larger bureaucracies, increased taxes, and widened state authority, but also to new ways to mobilize citizens to serve as private arms of state power. Tell me again how I'm misreading this stuff when they're the ones writing it. Anybody? Unraveling the history of the Trading with the Enemy Act highlights, in particular, how much the transformation of the modern American state has occurred by means of stretching of laws during times of perceived crisis. Again, I did not write this shit, people. Cambridge University Press. Cambridge University is a law university. This is who is writing this stuff. They're telling you what history is saying. The Trading with the Enemy Act served as the statutory foundation for the nation's emergence as what might be called a sanctioning state. A sanctioning state by using policies known as statutes. A police state. Statist, I see. Statist, I see. Statist, I see. Statistic. The state's vital statistics jurisdiction, enumeration at birth, the creation of a United States business that can then be sanctioned. This phrase has a dual meaning. It first denotes a state that frequently uses sanctions as a foreign policy tool. Foreign policy tool, not a domestic policy tool. So what are they doing? Using against a domestic United States business. They demand you give them ID, and then as soon as you give them the ID, guess what? They want a sanction. Why? Since 1945, the United States has been the world's leading user of sanctions, imposing them often unilaterally against nations and individuals that have expropriated the property of U.S. nationals. United States citizen is a United States national. United States business means United States citizen. Therefore, a United States citizen and a United States national are property of the United States as nationals. violated human rights norms, or challenged American visions of proper conduct in other ways. Second, the term sanctioning state refers to the legal and bureaucratic state apparatus required to implement contract terms and conditions required to implement and sustain sanctions regimes over months, years, and in some cases, decades. Gentlemen sitting in prison are there because they've been sanctioned through implementation of state apparatus, through legal and bureaucratic sanctions, because they have contracted with the state and then violated that contract. And yet the state can't bring that contract forward, because then it would show that the person that they contracted was not an eligible contract participant. The history of the Trading with the Enemy Act illuminates how this apparatus expanded over time to meet the needs of a sanctions imposing foreign policy. Again, it's not domestic, folks. If they're imposing it on you, then they're considering you foreign. It's a foreign policy. Because presidents and their lawyers felt it was important to ground policies in legal authority, law was repeatedly called upon to justify such economic warfare policies. Not surprisingly, then, lawyers were central to shaping the Trading with the Enemy Act's secret life. It lay dormant for long stretches during the 20th century, but lawyers remembered where it slept, and at key moments reminded policymakers of powers it might grant once awakened. Over time, lawyers made the act the keystone in a broader legal infrastructure. And that says infrastructure. In other words, you have to be part of that association for it to be qualified. Okay? That permitted the implementation of long-running and wide-ranging sanctions. Permitted the implementation. So it wasn't permitted before, and by permitting it, it is now licensed. What do they call it when you're licensed? They say you're sanctioned to do it. In order to impose economic sanctions during peacetime, presidents generally cited the existence of a national emergency. The practice of emergency government has a long history in the United States, including Abraham Lincoln's seizure of virtually dictatorial authority in 1861. Franklin Roosevelt's extensive use of the emergency authority during the Great Depression, and Harry Truman's declaration of national emergency in 1950 during the Korean War. From 1976 to 2004, presidents declared another 38 national states of emergency, not including those responded to domestic natural disasters. By the end of 2017, the 28 separate declared national emergencies remained in place. The practice of emergency government has long a history in the United States, including Abraham Lincoln's seizure of virtually dictatorial authority in 1861. The Lieber Code, Article 10, martial law chiefly affects the police and the collection of public revenue and taxes. For the invading forces or the expelled government, its army, the safety of its army, and the safety of its operations. That's what we're dealing with. It's a standing army under soft martial law. The aggressive use of national emergencies, most justified under the Trading with the Enemy Act, contributed greatly in the 20th century to both the expansion of presidential powers and the development of what amounts to a permanent state of war. permanent state of war. The maintenance of a large standing army, the stationing of troops overseas, the concentration in presidential hands of the practical power to declare and wage war, all of these departed in important ways from the original vision of the nation's founders. But that's what we have today, the maintenance of a large standing army. What do you think the budget is all about in that military? That's the largest portion of the budget, and that's literally a standing army. That's a military, not a militia. See, the militia is the republic. The military is a corporate entity. That's a standing army. That's privatized. The story of the Trading with the Enemy Act shows how the creative application of statutes advanced this dramatic transformation and emphasizes the role of statutes in shifting the practical meaning of the Constitution over time. It also highlights how these changes have been produced through political contestation and cooperation between Congress and the executive. They know exactly what's going on. They know exactly what they're doing, folks. Do you? Oh, but none of that's important. That's why you go out and vote still. That's why you still got an ID in your wallet. That's why you're still banking with the bank instead of establishing a trust account with the proper authorities. Providing your own accounting. Establishing your own plenipotentiary powers of peace, amnesty, indemnification. The basic contours of the debate over emergency rule are little changed since two political scientists staked them out in the 1940s. In 1947, Princeton professor Edward Corwin lamented that the combination of two world wars and the Great Depression had transformed a constitution of rights that protected individuals into a constitution of powers that concentrated authority in the national government in general and the executive branch in particular. Corwin traced the origins of this change to 1917. The modern constitution of powers, he claimed, was merely the Constitution of World War I, adapted to peacetime uses in an area whose primary demand upon government is no longer the protection of rights, but the assurance of security. States of emergency, Corwin suggested, had stripped Americans of their fundamental rights and reduced the republic to a quasi-authoritarian state. States of emergency, Corwin suggested, had stripped Americans of their fundamental rights and reduced the republic to a quasi-authoritarian state. The following year, Clinton Rossiter, Corwin's former graduate student, suggested a different reading. Rossiter argued that the phenomenon of emergency government originated in ancient times. Constitutional dictatorship, he argued, was a necessary and potentially beneficial component of constitutional systems. During times of acute crisis, even democracies needed to arm the government with enhanced powers in order to survive. So when you have a military supporting a democratic government and the militia in its republic form can't stand up and throw out that despotic government because that despotic government is saying that during times of acute crisis, even democracies needed to arm the government with enhanced powers in order to survive. If that's the very government you're trying to throw off, that's what they're trying to do, is make sure they survive. So they have to enhance their powers. That's beyond their power. They do not have the power not given to them by the people. Do you understand what's going on, people? During times of acute crisis for who? If the people decide that it's an acute crisis for them to continue to allow a despotic government to rule and rise up against that despotic government, of course it's going to be an acute crisis for that despotic government. Even democracies, it's a democratic government, not a republic, needed to arm the government with enhanced powers in order to survive. It's the only way they can survive. And that's why they need to be thrown off. If they come to such great lengths that they enhance their own powers so that it's for their survival, then you understand that your rights mean nothing against their survival. It is a life and death survival situation. It's vital, you might say. While it is important to establish safeguards to protect rights during emergency conditions and to ensure the reestablishment of normal rule, republics and an emergency government were fundamentally compatible. The problem here is the government cannot establish the safeguards to protect your rights. You have to. You have to establish the safeguards to protect your own rights, and then you can empower the government to do so with and for you. But they can't establish that power themselves. See? Scholarship since 911 has resuscitated this older debate. Many analysts concluded that emergency powers subvert the rule of law and undermine basic Republican and democratic values. Such works often highlight Italian philosopher Giorgio Agamben's concept of the state of exception. Remember, we've been talking about exceptions lately. Agamben argues that modern states invoke the existence of a state or of emergency or exception in order to exercise powers previously unavailable to them. This is the safe harbor exceptions because of the doctrine of necessity. Things have changed, so we have to create a new exception, including even the power over human life. Let that sink in. When does a government exercise powers previously unavailable to them, including even the power over human life? Isn't that why they go to wars? Because they think they have the power over human life? And yet you keep voting them into office so they can go to war. They're just not going to war with you. The fuck they aren't. They posed that war when they told you you had to get an ID. You fell for it like a sucker. You need a passport to get out of the country that you were born in? Come the fuck on. Sounds like a prison to me. For Agamben, this exception describes a space where law in practice no longer applies, and which therefore facilitates the untrammeled use of power and violence. This state of exception, Agamben argues, has continued to function almost without interruption from World War I through fascism and National Socialism and up to our own time, and has today reached its maximum worldwide deployment. (2017) article, folks. Cambridge University Press. A second strain of thought sees emergency powers as contained within the constitutional order. To say that emergency powers constitute an exception to the law is to suggest that a normal, non-exceptional law reigns the rest of the time. So what is the norm and what is the emergency? And who is it an emergency to? See, that emergency isn't my emergency. I don't live my life in fear and in emergency, in a state of emergency. Like I said, I don't even have a bank account or an ID. Some legal scholars have argued that rather than interpreting emergency powers as the absence of legality, it is better to imagine them as a parallel form of law. In her study of European empires, for instance, Lauren Bent suggests that pockets of legal anomaly created in empire appear more often as pattern variations of legal ordering that is as instances of exception. Legal scholar David Kennedy points out that many allegedly lawless outposts of the war on terror are in fact governed by law. It is simply that different rules apply and different rules do not apply. It is possible to cite this basic continuity to condemn the entire modern liberal system. In this critique, both normal and emergency rule are fundamentally authoritarian. Anybody else agree with that? Yeah, so it doesn't matter if it's non-exceptional law. Even if it's a normal law, it's still authoritarian. And I'll refer to, what was it? I have to refresh myself. Romans 2, verse 14. For when the Gentiles, which have not the law, do by nature the things contained in the law, these, having not the law, are a law unto themselves. So we don't need somebody else to pose a law for us. We don't need the authoritarians. Even though they pose themselves as authoritarians, we have this equal station life where we can show where we get our authority as our own authoritarian. People said all the time when I was younger, you seem to have a problem with authority, young man. No, I don't have a problem with authority. My problem is that you think you have authority over me when I can handle my authority pretty goddamn fucking well myself. Others are less critical. Legal scholar Kim Lane Sheppel observes that the United States since World War I has been virtually always in a state of emergency, one way or another, but emphasizes that this emergency condition has been normalized within the constitutional order. Absolutely. This is because Congress has given its blessing to the president's emergency authorities, often beforehand or shortly after. By delegating its powers to the executive, Congress has arguably undermined the founders' vision of limited executive power. But it has done so willingly, and while presidents have twisted and at times tortured the law in search of justification for their actions, they have rarely claimed that emergencies granted them power entirely beyond the reach of Congress or the courts. That would be total dictatorial, total communism. They cannot profess that. The history of the Trading with the Enemy Act provides support for this second interpretation. While presidents have taken the lead in imposing sanctions under the Act and have done so through the exercise of emergency powers, this is not a story of an unbound executive run amok. Rather, it shows a Congress willing to delegate power and a court system willing to bless this arrangement. Of course, because we have an administrative court system operating under judicial authority that, of course, decades ago, as part of this, everything that's gone on, one of the recent things that the Supreme Court has ruled on is the Chevron doctrine, where they've made blatant claim that the administrative courts have taken the delegated federal authority powers way too far beyond anything they were ever granted. Congress passed amendments to the Trading with the Enemy Act that significantly expanded the president's powers in 1917, 1918, 1933, 1940, and 1941, and made few attempts to rein them in afterwards. Even during the 1970s, when Congress, in a fit of legislative assertiveness, made an important amendment to the Trading with the Enemy Act, the executive retained nearly all powers that had initially applied only during wartime. This is the Chevron doctrine. The executive retained nearly all powers that had initially applied only during wartime. So they expanded those executive powers into times of peace, even if there wasn't an emergency. In the process of making, amending, blessing, and wielding the law, all three branches of government have built a more powerful state capable of conducting global economic warfare. Even during times of peace. Now, why would you want to do that? So why would you want to make such a statement? Because to have a global economic warfare means that you can manipulate any other country. And again, this is America stating this. This is the one world government. You know where the UN is located now? In New York. This outcome is quite different from the intentions of the original Bill's architects. In the beginning, the Trading with the Enemy Act had two primary functions: to prevent Germany from mobilizing American resources, and to conscript Germany or German property for the benefit of the U.S. war effort. The latter entailed seizing enemy funds, enemy referring to anyone living in the territory of the Central Powers, including American heiresses who had the misfortune of marrying Austro-Hungarian nobles and investing them in U.S. Liberty bonds. So, American heiresses, they weren't taking them from the foreign powers. They were taking them from the American people that had some kind of relation or connection to them as a matter of statutes to seize that property because it was relative to some foreigner. The act also allowed U.S. firms to license German chemical patents. No small thing in an age when German firms dominated synthetic chemistry. The patent for Salvarsan, then the most effective treatment for syphilis, was especially important considering the combination of war-induced pharmaceutical shortages and U.S. government fears about the sexual behavior of its new soldiers. So this isn't something new, folks. Again, it's been going on for decades. War-induced pharmaceutical shortages. Come on. Again, this is from Cambridge University Press. Opponents of the Trading with the Enemy Act complained that seizing such funds and assets violated basic property rights. They fretted about possible repercussions for post-war investment in the United States. We shall in the future as in the past, probably be applicants for the investment of foreign funds, noted Representative Ebenezer J. Hill. What position are we going to be in if we confiscate the stocks and bonds owned abroad? But the bill's backers pointed out that sequestering enemy property during wartime followed Britain's lead and comported with norms of civilized practice. The bill recognizes and affirms the interdiction of international law, asserted Representative Andrew Jackson Montague. Because it allowed the president to grant licenses to continue trade, it even relaxes the scope and rigor of such interdiction. In other words, if you get your grant from the president, who is to question that? Now, I'm not saying that you should apply for recognition by the president, but we should also recognize that if you are all children of God, then who doesn't recognize that? And why is it I need an ID supported by the president? Assistant Attorney General Charles Warren, the bill's main drafter, argued, moreover, that banning the actual transfer and transport of commodities was insufficient in an age when tremendous sums circuited the Atlantic via transfer of credits and money by letter T cable or wireless. So instead of banning the actual transfer and transport of those commodities, they came after them and seized them. Having just emerged because they couldn't have any, it wasn't sufficient. Having just emerged as the world's chief financier, the United States had immense economic power. Now tell me how the United States is a government if it's a chief financier as a United States corporate entity. Again, 28 U.S.C. 3002, subsection 15, you read it, ABC, it's going to tell you it's a corporation and not a federal government. And it consists of the agencies, departments, This war is to be won as much by dollars as it is by men and guns, said Republican John Heckle-Bus. And for this reason, we are trying in this bill to make it impossible for a dollar of trade or business to inure to the advantage of the enemy. So they're trying to limit their own dollar. And they have to limit it because they don't want it being used against them. Yet then they turn around and use that very same concept to turn around and take it from the people that have rightful possession of it, because they get butthurt and want to sanction somebody but can't sanction them because they're foreign. So they go after the domestic people. Again, I ask everybody to start seriously questioning this stuff, and that's why I do. We're done for tonight. I'll be back tomorrow night with more on Trading with the Enemy Act as it relates to those statutes. Those are contract terms and conditions. And you are literally contracting into a war, and that means you're going to start filling out official documentation under the Uniform Commercial Code, which is literally known as the Battle of the Forms. And you need a license to do so. So, in the meantime, You guys know me. I love you. I don't give a rat's ass whether you love me back. Let's say I don't care if you hate me. I don't care if you don't respect me. That's on you. So we'll see everybody again next time. May God bless you. Have a good night.